Greetings, hypothetical students, and welcome back to the Not-So-Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. If you do not know what the Not-So-Hypothetical Victorian Literature course is, let me tell you. This is a series that I run on my channel in which every 2 months I take 2 different Victorian books and talk about a particular theme in those Victorian books. So the idea is that what I'm doing here is the kind of course that I might hypothetically run where I lecture at a university teaching a course on the Victorian novel. The idea is that this series will be a very, very long introduction to the Victorian novel and all the many glorious themes that come up in Victorian literature. There is a Goodreads group which I'll link down below, and I'll also link down below the previous 2 episodes of the Not-So-Hypothetical Victorian Literature course. The way that the course works is that I announce on the Goodreads group and also in these videos in the sort of previous one what the 2 books are we'll be looking at in the next couple of months, and then every 2 months I make a video talking about 2 books in a particular theme in those 2 Victorian novels. And when I do the video, the first half of the video is entirely spoiler-free, so I'm not giving away any big plot points, so that if you haven't read the books and you don't have the time to read 2 Victorian novels every 2 months, then you can still get something out of the video and watch the first half. And then the second half of the video is full of spoilers and talks about the plot in great detail and so on. Today, in the Not-So-Hypothetical Victorian Literature course, we are looking at the theme of the city, and we're going to be looking at how the city as a place and the city as an idea is explored in Elizabeth Gaskell's Mary Barton and George Gissing's The Netherworld. So that you all know what I'll be doing in the next few months as well. The next 2 episodes of the Not-So-Hypothetical Victorian Literature course will also be to do with settings. So today it is still July, and we're looking at the city in Mary Barton and The Netherworld. Then in September we'll be looking at small towns and how the small town as a setting works in George Eliot's Middlemarch and Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. And then in November this year I'll do a video on rural areas and the countryside and how it is explored in Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. So, now that the introduction and explanations are over, let us get into talking about the city in these 2 glorious books. So before we get into the analysis, let me tell you a little bit about these 2 books in case you have not yet read them. The Netherworld is a novel by George Gissing which was published in 1889, and it explores the lives of various very, very poor people living in the slums of London in the 1870s. It's not a very happy book. I think Gissing has a good claim for being the urban Hardy, or that Hardy has a good claim for being the rural Gissing. They both explore quite similar themes. The Netherworld is a fascinating, fascinating book. It is one of the most depressing books I've ever read, but it's really, really brilliant. I think it's one of the best novels written in the Victorian period. It's fascinating in its exploration of class, in its exploration of London as a place. I loved rereading it this time because it's set in Clerkenwell, and the first time I read this book when I studied it at uni about 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't know Clerkenwell at all as an area. It's not an area of London I'd ever been to. But for all of 2016 I worked in offices in Clerkenwell, and like every street name they mention, I know that street. I've walked across that street. The first scene in The Netherworld is a man walking across Clerkenwell Green. Literally the offices I worked at were on Clerkenwell Green. I know everywhere in this book, and it's wonderful. It's fascinating to look at this book in terms of the city, knowing London and knowing this bit of London as I do, and also knowing how absolutely different it is now from then. In the 1870s, Clerkenwell was slums. Clerkenwell is really, really the opposite of slums now. The characters in this book are all from a very, very poor background. They're all sort of manual labourers, but not in industrial factories. Netherworld is set in London, so it's not an industrial novel as so many other novels are in the 19th century that deal with cities, but it does really explore the way that the London poor are treated and the way that the London poor feel and the way that life is for so many of these people in the 1870s. And it is a brilliant, brilliant book. And one thing I'll especially talk about later, which I think is fascinating in here, is the way that it explores the kind of claustrophobia of the city and the hopelessness of the city, and the way that London as a kind of thing seems to strangle out so much of the goodness in the world. Mary Barton is a very different exploration of the city. It's set much earlier in the Victorian period across the 1830s and 40s. It's mostly set in the industrial city of Manchester, although sections of the book are also set in Liverpool, and I will talk a bit about the presentation of Liverpool in Mary Barton as well later. Mary Barton, like The Netherworld, very much looks at the working class experience of the city and how life in Manchester and the poor living conditions of Manchester for working class people in the 1830s and 40s, how that affects their lives and how that affects the way people behave. So I've picked 2 sort of very working class presentations of the city within Victorian imagination, but I think especially as part of the interest in the city in Victorian imagination is this idea of this new mass of urban working working classes, I thought these two would be really interested to look at. So the other thing I want to quickly talk about before we get on to my main points is a bit about the city within Victorian history and within the Victorian imagination. In Britain, the city was almost a new phenomenon in the 19th century. There was mass urbanisation over the course of the Victorian period in a way that it had never happened before. In 1801, a third of Britain's population was urban, a third of Britain's population lived in towns and cities. By 1911, it was 79%. So over the course of the 19th century, so many people moved to cities for work, for this new kind of industrial work, and the way that this changed how people behaved and the way that it changed the way people thought about place is really interesting. One thing I think is interesting, I'll talk a little bit more about later, is the difference between London and the industrial cities. The places like Manchester and Preston in the north, which are driven by manufacturing, are quite different in the way they're presented within Victorian literature in comparison to somewhere like London, which is very varied and huge, and there isn't like a set industry, and there are probably a lot more sort of smaller workshops than big factories. And also then again we have somewhere like Birmingham, which is much more sort of craft driven, and again smaller workshops rather than big factories. Silverware was a massive thing in Birmingham, much more than cotton. I'm not going to be talking about Birmingham today, but it's also interesting to see how that differs. And then again Liverpool, as it's brought up in Mary Barton, Liverpool is a place of trade, there are docks. Liverpool as a city is characterised very differently to Manchester and London throughout Victorian literature. But although there are differences between all these different kinds of cities, the city with like a big capital letter was a thing in the 19th century. It was a massive important thing within Victorian imagination, this idea of the city as this new thing which was dirty, crowded and immoral. Within Victorian culture and literature you do sometimes get this sort of idealisation of the countryside and an idealisation as well of sort of the rural poor. Quite a lot of Victorian poetry you get a lot about like shepherdesses and shepherds. The idea that being working class in a rural area is somehow pure and traditional and good, whereas being working class in an urban area is very much not that. And often the urban working classes are characterised in Victorian culture and Victorian literature by being unclean, unruly and immoral. It's fascinating how within Victorian culture the rural poor are often idealised, whereas the urban poor are often demonised. And I think the way that these two books explore how the urban poor are treated and how the urban poor react to this, and how both of these books in an interesting way are writers from the lower middle class writing about the urban poor for a lower and upper middle class audience. And very often both Gaskell and Gissing make these kind of appeals to the reader of like, you have to try and understand these people, you have to try and understand what it's like. And both of these books are in many ways a defence of the way that people act when put in these situations, and I think that's something really fascinating to look at when you compare them. So in the first half of this video, in the spoiler-free section, I'm going to talk a bit about the landscape of the city in general and how cities are described. Then I'm going to talk about hygiene and health and living conditions in the city, and I'm then going to talk about poverty in the city and how the divide between the rich and poor affects the way that the city is experienced. Then after that, in the spoilery section of the video, I'm going to be talking about crime and morality in the city, because this is one of the most fascinating things within the Victorian imagination, this idea that the city is this massive hotbed of crime, the city is this immoral place. And then we'll be talking about like the hopelessness of the city and how cities are presented in these books as these claustrophobic, damaging places. And then I'm going to talk in contrast to that about the kindness of the city and how so many of these people in these urban communities can be really kind to each other, even despite all the misery and so on that's going on. And then finally I'll talk a little bit about the endings of these books and what conclusions they draw about the role of the city within Victorian society. So that has been quite enough of an introduction. Let's talk about the landscape of the city and how cities are described in these two books. So here's a passage from the very second page of the Netherworld in which a character is walking past a churchyard. The burial ground by which he had paused was as little restful to the eye as are most of those discoverable in the byways of London. The small trees that grew about it shrivelled in their leaflessness. The rank grass was wan under the failing day. Most of the stones leaned this way or that, emblems of neglect. They were very white at the top and darkened downwards till the damp soil made them black, and certain cats and dogs were prowling or sporting among the graves. At this corner the east wind blew with malice such as it never puts forth save where there are poorly clad people to be pierced. It swept before it thin clouds of unsavoury dust mingled with the light refuge of the streets. Above the shapeless houses night was signalling a murky approach. The sky, if sky it could be called, grew threatening of sleet, perchance of snow. and on every side was the rumble of traffic, the voiceless evidence of toil and poverty. Hawkers were crying their gods. The inevitable organ was clanging before a public house hard by. The crumpet man was hastening along with monotonous ringing of his bell and hoarse rhythmic wail. Gissing tells you so many significant things within this very short paragraph on the second page of the Netherworld. He talks about how the trees are withered, this idea that nothing can really survive or live in London. He talks about how the churchyard is full of cats and dogs, how all of the graves are neglected, this idea that even these spaces which should be in some way sacred are forsaken. He talks about the dust and dirt of London. He talks about the noise and the busyness. He talks about the poverty of it. There is so much in this small description which I think gets across a lot of Gissing's anger at London, because throughout the Netherworld there is a lot of anger at London as a place, which is something I find so fascinating. Even if you think about the title of the Netherworld, London in so much of this book, or at least Clerkenwell, is often presented as this kind of vision of hell. And here's another paragraph from a bit later on in the book when a character is going on the train from London to outside of London. Over the pest-stricken regions of East London, sweltering in sunshine which served only to reveal the intimacies of abomination. Across miles of a city of the damned, such as thought never conceived before this age of ours, above streets swarming with a nameless populace cruelly exposed by the unwanted light of heaven, stopping at stations which it crushed the heart to think should be the destination of any mortal. The train made its way at length beyond the outpost limits of dread, and entered upon a land of level meadows and hedges and trees, of crops and cattle. This idea of London being this sort of nameless hell, this city of the damned, this idea that London is miserable, hopeless, constrained, constricting, the idea that London is so full and busy with so many people and that everyone there seems so poor that there cannot be anything good about it, and also that it is this kind of abomination, it is this kind of unnatural blot upon the landscape and upon the world that this city kind of dares exist. And again, Gissing makes very, very clear here that for him this city, or this sort of city, this version of London is so much a 19th century invention, it is so much a product of the Victorian period and everything that has brought, and it is very, very, very clearly an evil to Gissing. And Mary Barton's presentation of Manchester is not nearly so damning and depressing as Gissing's presentation of London, but it does have some critical presentation. She talks about there being many half-finished streets, all so like one another that you might have easily been bewildered and lost your way. Many of the streets she talks about are unpaved, and she deals a lot with the poverty of the city and how poor many people's living conditions were within Manchester at the time, and also how dangerous working conditions were in the factories, which is so important to the city as a whole. Another thing that's fascinating in both of these books is the contrast between the city and the countryside. I talked about this a bit in the last not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course in the context of industrialisation, talking about the difference between the countryside and the industrial towns in hard times and north and south, and this again is very applicable here and very, very interesting, this idea that the city is this deafening, oppressive place and that the countryside is in some way a release from this. It's interesting that Mary Barton, which is a novel pretty much entirely set in the city, begins with a chapter set in the countryside. The very first chapter of Mary Barton is set in the countryside, out in the fields around Manchester, and then we go into the city. So we're set up with this kind of beautiful, glorious, sunny day in the countryside, and then they go back into Manchester and everything begins to go wrong from there. This is the very opening of the book. There are some fields near Manchester, well known to the inhabitants as Green Hay Fields, through which runs a public footpath to a little village about 2 miles distance. In spite of these fields being flat and low, nay, in spite of the want of wood, the great and usual recommendation of level tracts of land, there is a charm about them which strikes even the inhabitant of a mountainous district, who sees and feels the effect of the contrast in these commonplace but thoroughly rural fields with the busy, bustling manufacturing town he left half an hour ago. The idea that the countryside is beautiful and peaceful, and all the more so for the contrast with the city. Similarly, a paragraph in the Netherworld describing a trip outside of London to Essex. By the roadside you occasionally pass a mantle pool where perchance ducks or geese are enjoying themselves, and at times there is a pleasant glimpse of farmyard with stacks and barns and stables. All things as simple as could be, but beautiful on this summer afternoon and priceless when one has come forth from the streets of Clerkenwell. This idea that the countryside is all the more beautiful and poignant and all the more incredible and natural and correct in comparison to the constrained and unnatural city. The idea that the countryside is clean and the city is dirty, the idea that the countryside is free and empty and the city is so crowded. In chapter 6 of Mary Barton, a chapter entitled Poverty and Death, it's never going to be a good happy chapter when it's entitled Poverty and Death. In this chapter, John Barton and his friend Wilson go to visit a much poorer household in Manchester to try and help a man there with fever. And Elizabeth Gaskell talks about the disgusting conditions of this street. She says, "Never was the old Edinburgh cry of Garda Low more necessary than in this street. As they passed, women from their doors tossed household slops of every description into the gutter. They ran into the next pool, which overflowed and stagnated. Heaps of ashes were the stepping stones." Apparently, according to my Penguin Classics edition, when Elizabeth Gaskell says ashes, she doesn't mean ashes, she means waste of a much less pleasant variety. And this reference to the Edinburgh cry, which is French for "be careful of the water," is referring to people emptying chamber pots out of their window. The idea that not only is this place so unhygienic and the living conditions so bad, but also because it's a city and it's so cramped together, you can't escape from that bad living conditions, you can't escape from that kind of waste because it's everywhere, because the hygiene is so poor in this kind of place. And when they get to the house of the man they're going to visit, they see the main room in which the family live, and then they open the door to the back room. It led into a back cellar with a grating instead of a window, down which dropped the moisture from pigsties and worse abominations. It was not paved. The floor was one mass of bad-smelling mud. It had never been used, for there was not an article of furniture in it, nor could a human being, much less a pig, have lived there many days. The idea that everything in this city is filthy, and that because people have so little space, because there is so little space available, and because people are too poor to be able to afford better, this is the kind of living conditions that people are reduced to. We see similar things in the Netherworld in various descriptions of living conditions, especially in somewhere like Shooter's Gardens, where a character called Pennyloaf lives, which is described as being this tumbling down, incredibly messy and dirty place. And again, throughout the Netherworld, we are reminded about the lack of privacy. So many of the significant conversations between two characters take place in the open street because they have no privacy within their own homes because there are so many people. And I think that brings me on quite nicely to talking about health and hygiene within the city, especially in terms of Gaskell's description of that street and how unhealthy and unhygienic that street is. In Mary Barton and the Netherworld, like so many Victorian novels, death is no stranger to the characters. All of these characters have experienced close relations die from illness and bad health at some point in their life, because that is what happens in these places where conditions are so poor, where food is not always readily available, where medicine is not readily available, and where people live in these cramped, poor conditions. In Mary Barton, Elizabeth Gaskell talks about how illness is brought on by miserable living, filthy neighbourhood, and great depression of mind and body. The idea that in such living conditions, in the crowded, cramped, and unsanitised living conditions of the city in these times, there is just no way that people can escape illness. And as well as the illness and fever so regularly dealt with in both of these books, we also get in Manchester the extra danger and problems of factories and how working in a factory can often injure your health. One of the characters, Mrs. Wilson, is permanently disabled from an accident she had a very, very long time ago when she was a very young woman from working in a factory, and she has never really had the living conditions and the living standards to get over that accident. Another interesting thing mentioned in both of these books is issues to do with diet. In Mary Barton, it's often to do with the lack of food available and the fact that just simply so many people in this book are starving and cannot afford food. Whereas in the Netherworld, although there are those problems and there are those moments, there's also another issue here, which Gissing talks about interestingly, especially to do with the character of Pennyloaf. Pennyloaf very rarely has any money, and she has no idea how to cook. And so whenever she wants food, she goes to the shop and buys whatever takes her fancy, which are normally things that are large but not filling and really unhealthy. So she has this sort of terrible diet, as so many of these people do in the Netherworld, where even when they can afford to buy food, they don't know what food they should buy, and the shops nearby that provide for those kind of people, that provide for their class, don't provide food that's actually nourishing and actually healthy. So they end up living really bad diets, which of course contributes to their health. And this issue to do with food is so much of a kind of unique problem to the city. A lot of people living in the countryside would have had some outdoor land where they could have grown their own food, and even though crops didn't always work, and even though that was still problematic and difficult, they had more of an opportunity to do that than people living in the cities, which leads me on to talking about poverty and the city and to the divide between the rich and poor. There is this idea in the Netherworld that so much of the problems in society and so much of the problems of the city are caused by poverty and caused by money. George Gissing writes, "There will be no possibility of a perfect faith between men until there is no such thing as money." The different struggles these characters are having and the different way poverty presents itself in these two books is really, really interesting. In Mary Barton, the main struggle in this book is about food. It's mainly to do with characters not being able to afford food, often because they're out of work due to problems at the factory, due to trade union strikes, etc, etc, because they're not working, they're not getting an income in, and therefore they are having problems getting food. People are just not being fed, and that's partly because of the time it's set. It's set mostly in the 1840s, a decade literally known as the Hungry 40s. In Mary Barton, again and again you hear the word clemming, clemming being a Victorian Manchester dialect word for starving. Again and again Elizabeth Gaskell talks about these children who are underfed and how no one has enough food. But in the Netherworld it's mostly about rent, and there are both problems in both books. Like in Mary Barton there are sometimes concerns about rent, and in this there are sometimes concerns about food, but for the most part in London at this time, or at least in Gissing's presentation of it, food is cheap and the problem is rent. There's one scene in this where one of the characters, John Hewitt, is speaking at a kind of gathering on Clerkenwell Green, and he's speaking for a long time about rent and how it is kind of the bane of the workman's life, how everyone in this book is spending more than half their income literally just to put a roof over the heads of themselves and their families. And it is presented as this great kind of injustice, this great crime, especially when the living conditions are so poor. The fact that these people are spending so much money on rent. Many of the characters in this book move several times throughout the book. When they're not able to afford different properties, they have to downsize all the time. The main struggle in this book, the main bane of poverty, is rent. And within these two books, poverty and the city are really bound up together, and so many of the problems of poverty in these books are caused by the urban setting within which these characters live. They're caused by the expense of rent, the expense of food, the inability to grow your own food. They're caused by the kind of industrial strikes forced by trade unions in Mary Barton, which would never be able to happen in rural areas. They're caused by the sheer quantity of people and how often people are out of work. You can see this in the characters of John Hewitt in the Netherworld and John Barton in Mary Barton, who are quite similar characters in some ways, and both of them at points in the novel are out of work and resent that, not only because it leaves them without any money, but also because it's a matter of pride, because they want work, because they want to be able to feel that they are doing something to help their families. In both of these books we have the issue of work and savings, the idea that when in work these characters are earning enough to have a decent standard of living, but the moment they fall out of work they have no savings to fall back on because they never earned enough for that, and therefore they're immediately plunged into much greater poverty. And so much of these issues to do with lack of work is to do with the sheer quantity of people in these places, the fact that if they turn one man away they have so many others to go to, which means that there are just too many people to be given this kind of work, that the promise of work and how much work was demanded in these cities has brought so many people to these places, and yet there isn't actually the work to provide for them. This is John Hewitt describing what happened one day when he heard about a possibility of work and went to find out about it. Didn't I go after that job? I got there at 8:30, and what do you think I found? If there was one man standing at Gorbitt's door, there were 500. Don't you believe me? You go and ask them as lives there. If there was one, there was 500. The idea that so much as a small job that's not even well paying can bring that sheer quantity of people, because there are so many people in this city that there just isn't the capacity to provide for them, there just isn't the work for all of these people. And another thing that's interesting in both of these books is the huge divide between the rich and poor. Both of these books are very, very working class books in that there is, for the most part, a complete absence of anyone of different classes. A novel like North and South, for example, which I talked about in the last not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course, deals with a lot of working class characters within the industrial place of Milton, which is kind of Manchester but a reimagining of it. But it also deals with manufacturers themselves, and Margaret Hale, is the main character, is the daughter of a clergyman, so they are the middle class. In Dickens's Our Mutual Friend, for example, and a lot of his novels, we have a big social cross-section between the rich and the poor within London. But in both of these books there is a massive focus on people from the working classes, and characters from the upper classes and the middle classes don't feature that much. The Carsons, who are the only sort of important middle class family in this book, are never that developed, and you normally only see them in snapshots, and they're not the focus, and they're often a side point, and you don't actually get to see that much of their lives apart from in 1 or 2 chapters. And then in the Netherworld there's like 2 characters out of a cast of, I don't know, 50 who are not from the very lower working classes. We have the character of Miss Lant, who works at a soup kitchen, who Jane Snowdon, the main character of the Netherworld, goes to work at the soup kitchen with for a bit. And we also have the character of Mr. Percival, a lawyer who is not in it very much but is kind of distantly there to oversee legal matters to do with wills. And that is all. All we see in this book is the Netherworld, the underworld. These people have no connection with people from upper classes. In Mary Barton that is quite different, and a lot of the tension and drama in Mary Barton comes from the anger and the divide and the conflict between masters and men, between the working classes and the manufacturers. And yet the workers and the manufacturers really don't understand each other and don't see eye to eye, even though so many of the manufacturers used to be working men themselves. And part of the issue at stake here, part of the problem in both of these books, is this massive divide between the rich and poor, and the fact that they don't understand each other and they have no contact with each other. And this again is a very urban problem, I think, because it is to do with the separation of space. Whenever you read Victorian novels set in the countryside, there's often a lot more interaction between classes, because even if people from upper class families in the countryside didn't view people from the lower classes or farmers working on their estates as tenants, even if they didn't view them as anywhere near equal to themselves, even if they viewed them only with patronisation, they did go and see them and speak to them, and they did have some contact with them. Whereas in the Netherworld, and to a lesser extent, but also still to a certain extent, Mary Barton, there's just no contact between classes, and therefore it is almost impossible for classes to understand each other, and this comes from the quantity of people and the kind of segregation of space within these cities. So I think that's all I wanted to talk about in terms of the spoiler-free section of the video. So if you have not read these two books, I would advise you to leave the video now, and I will talk more for the rest of you who have now read these books. So now that we are into the spoilery section of the video, I'm going to talk about crime and morality within the cities, because this is something fascinating, and the way that the city and crime and the city and immorality are bound up in the Victorian imagination is fascinating. The Victorians really did believe in many ways that cities were these hotbeds of crime, and in many ways they were. A lot more crime happened in cities, or there was the kind of poverty and social injustice that prompted crime. There were so many more opportunities for crime, a lot more potential victims and a lot more potential criminals, because so many people were living together in these crowded spaces. And this is something that both of these books explore in a really interesting way, especially because, as I can now talk about, now that we're in the spoilery section, both of these books have crime as very, very important features of them. Crime is a massive part of both of these books. Obviously, like, the main driving point of the plot of Mary Barton is a murder, and in the Netherworld there are so many significant crimes. We have the forgery that Bob Hewitt, we have the planned murder of Joseph Snowdon by Clem and Bob, which never goes off, and then we have the actual murder of Mrs. Peckover by her daughter Clem, and that's in terms of the actual literal criminal stuff. And then throughout these books there is a lot of exploration of kind of immorality and other sort of vices, I suppose, of the city. Drink and alcoholism is a massive part of both of these books, in terms of the character of Esther in Mary Barton and in terms of the character of Mrs. Candy in the Netherworld. In Mary Barton we have John Barton, who is addicted to opium, and his addiction to opium is part of what causes him to commit the crime to murder Mr. Carson. In Mary Barton, Esther tells Jem Barton that even if she wanted to, she could not live a virtuous life because she is so dependent on alcohol, because she is so dependent on drink. We have Mrs. Candy, who is barely conscious for most of the novel, who just spends the whole time completely drunk, whose son, Stephen Candy, also is completely reliant on alcohol and basically lives his life for the free points he gets at work as his job as a potman in a bar, because there is nothing else really worth living for. When Gissing writes about what the working classes of London in the 1870s do on a bank holiday, the phrase he says is, "Throw wide the doors of the temple of alcohol." The moment there's a bank holiday, the moment people are free and off work, everyone goes to the pub and everyone gets horrendously drunk, including Bob Hewitt, who then treats Pennyloaf abominably and like starts the whole misery of their lives. Like, drink is so much of a problem, and the idea of immorality, of the problems of drink and opium addiction in the cities, is very, very interestingly explored in both of these books, because it is, a lot of the time, it is to do with the cities. It is the city which drives these people to these things. The reason why these characters take to drink is because they have like nothing else to live for. Stephen Candy drinks because he works from before 8 in the morning to after midnight at night, and he has no time to do anything but like drink and sleep and work. There is this idea in both of these books that cities by their very nature are unrespectable. Take this from the beginning of chapter 6 in the Netherworld. It is a short street which, like so many in London, begins reputably and degenerates in its latter half. The idea that the streets of London are by their nature unrespectable, that every street has its own like bad side at one end. And again we see this combination of the city and poverty causing immorality. The moment that Joseph Snowdon inherits all the money from his father and is suddenly rich and also has the possibility of leaving London, he says to Scawthorne, "Don't you think I'm 10 times as honest a man today as I was yesterday? Poor devils can't afford to be what they'd wish in the ways of honesty and decent living." And although Joseph Snowdon is not really a man to be trusted, you do kind of believe him, and after that point he does try and care for his daughter and provide for her in some way. Scawthorne is a similar example of someone who is driven to immorality by poverty. In the first half of the book he's an immoral character, you don't like him, but as the book goes on and towards the end he has this kind of moral redemption where he falls in love with Jane. When Scawthorne first proposes to Jane, it is because he thinks that he is going to get some money out of Joseph Snowdon from it. But the second time he proposes is after he's found out that Joseph Snowdon has died and also lost all his money at the same time, and he does it just because he now loves Jane, and now that he is in a better financial position, now that he is going to be a partner in a law firm, now that he's going to be in the middle classes and isn't going to have to worry about money as much, he can be a good person and he can love properly and honestly and truly and virtuously, and isn't that fascinating? One of the great debates within Victorian society was to do with poverty and immorality, because for the Victorian middle and upper classes, the poor were really immoral, and some people thought that they were poor because they were immoral and therefore it was like a just desert from God. But there was a massive backlash in the Victorian period against such thoughts, and a lot of writers like Gissing, like Gaskell, like Dickens, writing that actually maybe it was that some people were immoral because they were poor and they were forced into immorality. And you see that a lot in both of these books, I think. And there is this great sense in these books about when people commit crimes that it's kind of not their fault. Even Clem Peckover to a certain extent, because obviously she's a horrible character and the way she treats Jane is unforgivable, and you have to hate Clem. Like, she is one of the most horrible characters in all of Victorian literature. But the moment when Bob dies and she is just broken, in her fierce animal way she was attached to Bob, and for the first time in her life she knew a genuine grief. In her cold, ruthless life, he is the only person she cared about at all, and she did genuinely care about him. And in that moment, when you see her genuine love for Bob, no matter in what strange way, you can understand that she could have been something better in a different world, even though she was planning with Bob to murder her husband, even though she later murders her mother, and even though you're pretty sure she would really like to murder Jane Snowdon if she got the chance. There is that one moment of humanity in her where you can see that maybe she could have been something better, and because her mother is almost as bad as her and just more clever about it, you can also kind of understand why she has that hatred for her mother and why a lot of her immorality is kind of caused by her upbringing. Similarly with Bob and the way he is brought toward forging money, it is presented as this thing that is kind of not his fault, and he is very much presented by Gissing as a young man who could have been better if his circumstances had been better. Society produces many a monster, but the mass of those whom, after creating them, it pronounces bad are merely bad from the conventional point of view. They are guilty of weaknesses, not crimes. Weakness, vanity, a sense that he has not satisfactions proportionate to his desert, a strong temptation. Here are the data which, in ordinary cases, explain a man's deliberate attempt to profit by criminality. The idea that Bob is driven to commit crimes by opportunity and vanity and misery as well. If he is a monster, he has been produced by his society, he has been produced by the city and the poverty within which he lives. You can see the same in Mary Barton in the case of John Barton when he kills Harry Carson, and later he says to Mr. Carson, to the father of the young man that he has killed, he says, "I did not know what I was doing. God knows I didn't." John Barton is in many ways the most fascinating character in Mary Barton, because what Gaskell does with him from the very beginning is set up how good he is. We see this when his wife dies, we see this when he goes and pawns like everything he owns to help a poor sick man who he doesn't even know and to provide for that man's family though he doesn't know him. He's set up from the beginning to be a kind, good person. He is a kind father to Mary, and over the course of the book we see him unravel slowly in connection with his son's death, his wife's death, in connection with his disappointments of the Chartist movements, his frustration with Parliament and how nothing ever gets done, in the grief he feels, in all the poverty and misery surrounding him, in the grief at his unemployment. We watch him unravel and we see the trade union's pressures to him, and we get to a point where we can perfectly understand how he could commit this crime. And this is what Gaskell does fascinatingly here, is she shows how the pressures and the problems of poverty and of the city can build up to lead someone to crime. And therefore in this way what both of these books do is explore the deep connection between criminality and the city within the Victorian period, but they do it by showing how the situations and the poor circumstances, the things they are critiquing about these cities, how they can lead to crime and how they can cause it. Next I want to talk about the kind of hopelessness and the claustrophobia of the city, the idea that these places are in some way escapably bad. The idea that these places are, as I read in that Gissing quote earlier, damned, that London is in some way this damned city. One thing I found strange in the Netherworld is how Gissing talks about how London is never ever sunny. He says, the blessed sunlight so rarely shed from a London sky. The idea that in London they're even deprived sunlight, like they can't even get sunlight. Both of these places are often described as perpetually grey. There's a bit in Mary Barton where Elizabeth Gaskell talks about it raining and how in the countryside this will be a pleasant, beautiful rain, but here in Manchester it's just grey and miserable. There is this idea that these places are somehow inescapably miserable, that in both of these cities, in Manchester and in London, people must be unhappy, that there is always going to be poverty, there's always going to be poor health. Even when people have like a few months of happiness or a few months of things looking better, everything will always get worse. There's a bit near the beginning of the Netherworld where Sydney says to Jane, "Keep a good heart, Jane, things will get better someday, no doubt. Do you think so, sir?" And then he mutters to himself and says nothing more. And it's so miserable because they don't get better, do they? Not in the Netherworld. It's just like misery upon misery upon misery. Like, oh, I think there are some brilliant moments, and I think there are some moments of real poignancy and happiness, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but for the most part it's really, really miserable, and there is no happiness to be had in this place. There's only misery and strain, and that is to a certain extent true in Mary Barton, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the video about the endings of these books and how they deal with the city, or the absence of the city indeed, in Mary Barton. But I do think, especially in sort of Mary's love in Jem, and Jem being declared not guilty in the end in Liverpool, in the final, not exactly reconciliation, but the strange scene between Mr. Carson and John Barton, where they discuss the fact that John Barton has killed his son. I think there are more glimmers of hope and possibility of escape from this world in Mary Barton than there are in the Netherworld. But both of these books do definitely present this idea of these confusing, dense, claustrophobic places. This issue of the lack of sunlight in the Netherworld, and then in Mary Barton this issue of the streets being all the same in Manchester so that it's so easy to get lost. Think of the fear and confusion that Mary feels when she goes to Liverpool. She doesn't know things, she can't work out where she is. The idea that the city as a place is overwhelming in its confusion and its misery. And there are such moments of utter misery and despondency in the Netherworld. Think of Pennyloaf Candy lying in bed on her wedding night with her new husband passed out drunk beside her, thinking how in the morning she's going to have to pawn her wedding ring. Like, I think that is genuinely like the saddest bit in like all of literature. Like, that bit is so incredibly just miserable. I know Hardy is depressing, and I know sometimes it can feel like Hardy has a monopoly on like the bleak within Victorian literature, but I think that moment, is one of the starkest, bleakest, like best written miserable bits in all of Victorian literature. Another bit that stands out for me later on in the book is where Sidney is looking at his drawings on the wall and knowing that he will never want to paint again. The impulse would never come again. It was associated with happiness, with hope, and what had his life to do with one or the other? The idea that now there is just no hope in his life, that hope has been crushed. And this is the thing about the Netherworld, is that hope and happiness are not allowed to prevail. Like, part of the reason why Sidney loves Jane, part of the reason why he loves her, is because she laughs. Because there is some, as he describes it, an element of joy in her character. The idea that she is happy and has hope and happiness and belief in goodness and an ability to make other people happy in this wretched, miserable, unhappy world. That is why he loves her. That is the beauty of Jane for Sidney. That is why she becomes his ideal that he cannot get. But they're not allowed to be together. Like, that can't happen because there's not even that hope allowed. There's not even the hope of people in love in misery allowed here. They have to be apart forever, meeting once a year at the grave of Mr. Snowdon. Like, it's so sad and it's so utterly hopeless, and that is what is so interesting about the Netherworld, how completely unstoppable the force of this hellish city is. And yet, for all that, there is a kind of kindness in both of these books, and this I think is really important and interesting to look at, because part of the identity of the city within a modern imagination is to do with anonymity and to do with the breakdown of communities and to do with the breakdown of local friendships. The idea that, you know, now if you live in a big city, you're very unlikely to know who your neighbours are, you're unlikely to know the people on your street. The idea of anonymity and the lack of community is a massive worry in, like, the concept of the city within a modern imagination, but that is not something that you necessarily get here. And obviously there is a lot of cruelty in these books, and there are people who are cruel to each other. For example, Clem Peckover is just horrible to everyone. But there are also moments in both of these books of huge kindness between people, of huge selflessness and generosity between people, which can in places redeem things, and is one reason why I don't think that the Netherworld is entirely depressing. There's that bit towards the end of the book where Sidney Carton says to Clara, "We are husband and wife, Clara, we must be kind to each other." The idea is that in this hopeless, miserable world, all they have left is kindness. And so they try, even though they're not happy, even though everything has gone wrong, even if both of them wanted a different life to the one they've ended up with, they try to be kind to each other and they try and do their best. And there are moments of huge kindness in the Netherworld. If you think about the relationship between Jane and Pennyloaf, their friendship is like, for me, the most positive thing in the book, and I love it. And I love that moment at the end of the book where Jane goes to see Pennyloaf and they make a joke about how Pennyloaf's son is hiding under the blankets, and they have fun and they try to put happiness in their lives. There is a moment much earlier on where Pennyloaf says to herself that she doesn't care how crap her life is as long as Jane comes to see her. The idea that their friendship and the small moments of kindness between them can make their life in some way worthwhile and can make this city and this place less hopeless. Similarly, there is this strange moment where Bob Hewitt, in his pain, in his hurt, when he has been knocked down in the street by a horse and carriage, when he's on the run from the police, he goes to the home of his wife's mother, and there he finds his wife's mother and his wife's brother. And Mrs. Candy and Stephen Candy just look after him in this wretched place where they live, and they have literally nothing in their house because everything has been taken by the landlords, because literally their bedding has been taken because they have failed to pay the rent. And yet Stephen goes out to get him water and tries to look after Bob and tries to take care of him, even though Bob has been a horrible wife to Stephen's sister, even though they have nothing in common, even though they don't care about each other really. They do a bit because they care for humanity, and even though Bob is a horrible person, Stephen just gives him water and Stephen tries to help. This instinct to help people and small moments of kindness and generosity are so important in these books. You see the same with Mary Barton. I mentioned it already in how it develops John Barton's character, but the fact that John, after having seen a man sick with fever and the struggling family of this man, goes out and pawns like all of his best things to get money to pay to help this family who he barely knows. It sets up his character, but it also sets up the kindness between these people. And you see it a lot in the communities, the way the Wilsons talk to each other, the way Alice treats Mary, the way that Job and Margaret treat Mary. There's that great moment, which I love in Mary Barton, when Mary is running home. She's just found out that Jem has been arrested on charge of murder of Mr. Carston, and she is completely mad and frantic with it, and she passes this Italian boy who speaks hardly any English, who's shouting that he's hungry. She says, "Oh lad, hunger is nothing, nothing," and she runs home because she's got more important things to worry about. And then she stops and feels guilty. She gets food, she rushes back, she gives the boy the food, and she carries on because she knows that kindness to people and helping other people is hugely important. Likewise, if you look at her story when she gets to Liverpool, look at the boy who helps her try and find Will, look at the people who take her on the boat and then won't take her money because they want to help her, look at the couple who just like take her in. There is so much kindness within Liverpool and Manchester in this book. There is so much kindness in both of these books from people to each other. Even though there is also a lot of hatred and there is also a lot of anger, these moments of kindness and these kind of city communities really, really stand out in both of these books as being so important. Which leads me nicely onto talking about the two endings of these books and how they explore the city, because it's very significant that in the Netherworld, in which the characters are doomed to misery, they are also doomed to stay in London forever. They all stay in urban misery for the rest of their lives, and it's kind of depressing. And they're not happy, none of them are happy. They're not all completely miserable, and there is hope for like not utter misery, just a little bit of misery, but they're still pretty miserable. Whereas in Mary Barton, what happens is quite different. Jem and Mary and Jem's mother move to Canada, to the countryside, where they are happy. Fascinating, I think, how Mary Barton, which is a book so much about the city, is flanked by the countryside, how it begins and ends in rural spaces, and how it begins and ends in happiness in rural spaces. The first chapter and the last are happy chapters, and most of what happens in the middle is not happy, and that is so interesting that the countryside and happiness are again bound up, and misery and crime as well are bound up in the course of the city. In order to escape the associations of having been accused of a crime, Jem has to move from his urban life to a rural, better life. He takes Mary with him, and in the end, Margaret and Will come out to see him. Margaret gets her sight back. They move to the countryside and all the good things happen, and that is the conclusion of this book. They get out of the world and the poverty and the crime and the misery of Manchester, and they go to a rural, peaceful end. Let me just read you a paragraph from the last 2 pages of each of these books. This is from Mary Barton, the happier, rural ending. I see a long, low wooden house with room enough and to spare. The old primeval trees are felled and gone for many mile around. One alone remains to overshadow the gable end of the cottage. There is a garden around the dwelling, and far beyond that stretches an orchard. The glory of an Indian summer is all over, making the heart leap at the sight of its gorgeous beauty. This idea of this pure, rural, happy scene where Mary and Jem can live a happy life. In comparison too, for each life little for congratulation. He with the ambitions of his youth frustrated, neither an artist nor a leader of men in a battle for justice. She no saviour of society by the force of superb example, no daughter of the people, holding wealth in trust for the people's needs. Yet to both was their work given. Unmarked, unencouraged save by their love of uprightness and mercy, they stood by the side of the more hapless, brought some comfort to hearts less courageous than their own. Where they abode it was not all dark. Sorrow certainly awaited them, perchance defeat in even the humble aims they had set themselves, but at least their lives would remain a protest against those brute forces of society which fill with wreck the abysses of the netherworld. Not an ending that is as optimistic as Mary Barton. The netherworld ends with misery, and it ends with the inescapability of the city and the fact that these characters cannot escape this hellish urban world which they have fallen into, whereas Mary Barton ends with the characters escaping. They escape the misery and the poverty, they escape the city, and they move to the countryside and to another country. So yes, I think that is all I had to say in today's video. I hope this hasn't been too long. I have been filming for 2 hours, so we will see how long it ends up once I have edited it. It is now 10:20 at night, so I'm going to stop filming and go to bed. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back very soon with another bookish video, and the Not So Hypothetical literature course will return in 2 months' time with a video on small towns and their presentation in Middlemarch by George Eliot and Cranford by Elizabeth Gaskell. So a long one in Middlemarch but a short one in Cranford, and hopefully they can kind of meet in the middle. Thank you very much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts on all of these things down in the comments. And I think that is all for today. Hypothetical class dismissed.